In 1970, after the success of Bhuvan Shom, Mrinal Sen returned to Bengali cinema with three films: Interview, 1970, Calcutta 71, released in 1972, and Padatik, which literally translates into The Foot Soldier, but it was called The Guerrilla Fighter, 1973, set in and about his native city, Calcutta. The figure of an angry young Bengali youth at its core, Sen's Calcutta Trilogy opens up ways for thinking about cinema in a milieu that was caught up in the maelstrom of leftist politics and violence. The film's narratives carried ample references to radical Marxist and Maoist political leanings of the youth of the day. And to outline that ambition, I want to make three propositions. First, that these films could be viewed as a way of historicizing 20th century Indian history so as to provide a context for what seemed like a tumultuous present. This historicizing impulse of the trilogy makes it a productive site for an analysis of the idea of political cinema that we've heard reiterated, a theme that we've heard reiterated in several papers this morning. And it was a category that was actually widely in use in the commentarial literature from that period. Many critics, especially those with leftist political inclinations, judged the trilogy for whether or not it represented the worldview of politically radical youth of the day. That is to say, instead of seeing the films themselves as a sovereign project of crafting history, critical viewers judged them for how efficaciously they mirrored contemporary conditions and aspirations. After Ray's Oppu trilogy, which was made in the 1950s, we have in Sen's Interview, Calcutta 71, and Padatik, a trilogy that demonstrates a sort of, that actually has a kind of demonstrable fidelity, if you will, to the dictionary definition of the term trilogy. However, his trilogy is a far cry from the Bildungsroman that you see of the boy becoming man that you see presented in Ray's Oppu films. Set in Calcutta when the city was smoldering in the throes of a violent Maoist movement, the films variously featured a young Bengali male protagonist. Markedly different from Oppu, these figures signaled the arrival of a new and deeply precarious historical moment, one that had locked the protagonists into a dreadful and agonizing present without the possibility of a future. These are young men whose student days ended not too long ago, but they have little prospect of gainful employment. And the trilogy chronicles the death of their hopes for an ordinary life of middle-class flourishing. The city played a critical role in this account, and Calcutta by the late 1960s already resembled Mike Davis's Planet of Slums in certain ways, with a vast influx of rural populations and refugees. Caught in a gridlock of political strife, corruption, and violence, the city is depicted as a force that blocked all avenues for growth and development for youth. In thus conjoining anger with youth, Sen's Calcutta trilogy marked, I want to propose, the first on-screen appearance of the figure of the angry young man in Indian cinema. And this is my second proposition. Authoritative studies of the angry young man by scholars, many of whom we're fortunate to have us with today, have looked at this figure through the star persona of Amitabh Bachchan in popular Hindi cinema. And I have in mind particularly the works by Madhava Prasad and Ranjini Majumdar. They've offered very nuanced studies of this phenomenon, seeing in it a concatenation of varied influences, a troubled relationship to the mother, recalling the character of Karna in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, Bachchan's oratic ability to distill through his brooding on-screen image and distinctive voice both the past of youth in small-town India and a future in an urban metropolis such as Bombay, and most importantly, epitomizing the anger and desire for revenge in youth in the pre-emergency city at a time when the hopes and yearnings unleashed by the promise of nationalism had been dashed. Coincidentally, the last film of the Calcutta trilogy, Padatik, released in 1973, the same year that Bachchan incarnated the angry young man in popular Hindi cinema as Inspector Vijay Khanna in Zanjeer. But Sen's angry young men have little in common with Bachchan's numerous Vijay characters. While the rest of my talk will trace that genealogy, even if summarily, suffice it to note that Sen's youth were marked by a striking absence of revenge towards any single individual or entity. Nor were they fueled by a sense of injury to family. In fact, throughout the trilogy and in later works, Sen issues a quiet but sustained critique of established gender norms in the middle-class family. His angry young man is not a paragon in any way of gender equity. Indeed, he shows little awareness of the skewed gender dynamics in the family or in society at large. Such a portrayal is strikingly different from the portrayal of the family, especially the mother-son dynamic, as that Madhav Prasad so eloquently discusses as masochistic fantasy in the context of your analysis of Amitabh Bachchan. So while the idea of, again, what you called a feudal family romance is a thing of the past for both sets of films, for both Sen and the Bachchan films, Sen articulates the need for a recognition of women as citizen subjects through his critical portrayal of male narcissism. They lack the heroic charisma and the immense powers exercised by Bachchan. For Sen, youth, rather than representing a stage in the growth of an individual, is a permanent condition for the possibility of the birth of political anger. Anger, a generalized feeling rather than directed at a single individual or group, is their only response, and we see a profusion of it on screen. It is perhaps to flag the systemic role of the city and to explain the rage generated from living in it among its male youth that Sen chose to insert it into the title of the second film in the trilogy, Calcutta 71. What is the significance of a literary object whose nomenclature is made up of a date and place? Asked the literature scholar James Chandler, who's also my colleague, of a different context. Under what circumstances, he queried, do we consider literary texts as representatives of specific cultures, as opposed to, say, life or the world or human cultures? Chandler's book, England in 1819, bespoke, and I quote, a British historicism in the sense that they arose from a distinctively British position in the then contemporary world culture, unquote. Sen's trilogy, too, historicized a particular place, Calcutta, at a particular moment in time. At the same time, Calcutta was also always seen in the context of a global history of the left. As he clarified in conversations, Calcutta presented him with a mirror through which to view the conditions prevailing in India and other parts of Afro-Asia and Latin America. In approaching the city as the site that reflected conditions of the global south more generally, Sen marked a self-conscious distance not only from the works of his peers such as Satyajit Ray and Ritik Ghotok, but also from a long tradition of Bengali literature. So what was the nature of the text that he offered us? And Moinakta has actually usefully and helpfully introduced some of them this morning, so let me just take it forward some more. The three films, you will have guessed, and some of you will have seen them, are quite varied in their narrative structure. That they hold together as a trilogy is both due to certain formal as well as deliberate narrative strategies through which Sen attempted to synthesize the narratives to make his larger historical argument. All three, if you see them, have shots featuring important Calcutta landmarks. So the Calcutta University, All India Radio, Dalhousie Square, Victoria Memorial Racecourse, as well as documentary and still footage of local and global events. Shots of Hindi and Bengali film posters, wall graffiti, newspaper headlines, statues of imperial and nationalist leaders, processions and picketing, police firings, images of Mao, Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Viet Cong and African soldiers are also common to all three films, and you may recall some of these from Padatik. They situate post-colonial Calcutta against a background of global protest movements in other parts of Afro-Asia and Latin America. Likewise, there are a profusion of avant-garde techniques, so freeze frames, jerky camera movements, and so on. And all of these elements taken together infuse in viewers who watched all three films a sense of continuum. But the actual narrative continuity was also emphasized with the second and third films in the trilogy referencing the earlier ones. So there's a courtroom scene with which Calcutta 71 opens, which actually is where Interview, the first film of the trilogy, left off. Likewise, Padatik opens with a shot of the young man being chased down the lanes of the city, which is a clear reference to a similar fugitive figure that you see in 71. More than any of these, however, the coherence of the trilogy was due to the way in which Sen organically built up a programmatic historical argument about anger and its aftermath. Seen thus, the films, though situated in a present, actually spanned a much longer temporal arc and possessed a unity that prevailed over their episodic nature. Sen's trilogy, unlike Ray's from the 1950s, in other words, is not the history of the becoming of an individual. Its focus is an emotion, anger, that manifests itself in the different characters but is then cathected onto the body of the citizen as the dominant feature of politics. And he maps the trajectory of this emotion and invites intellectual scrutiny of its politics over the course of the three films. Now, I have a much longer version of this paper where I have a detailed discussion of all three films. So very briefly, interview is actually about the travails of a young man who is looking for a suit in order to appear for an interview before a foreign company in Calcutta. And all kinds of disasters strike through the day. And in the end, he fails to get his suit and has to appear in a dhoti and kurta. And that's the reason that he's denied the job. Now, frustrated in his attempts and losing the job as a result, the film ends with a very strange conversation between the protagonist, Ranjit, played by the actor Ranjit Mollik, and an unseen interlocutor. It's an interesting scene to watch because you see Sen's fascination with French avant-garde techniques. In any case, so in this long conversation that he's having with the unseen protagonist, the unseen interlocutor, the interlocutor is very provocative. He says that, why did you apply for this job? You were actually interested in commissions and kickbacks, weren't you? And Ranjit says, of course I was. Why should I not have the aspirations for a better life, a better family, a better future? And suddenly, you see him explode in rage. He picks up a brick from the ground, and in a series of frames, you gradually see him turn, and there's a brightly lit shop window in which you see a male mannequin, and he hurls the stone at the shop window, and then runs to the store, to the inside of it, disrobes the mannequin, and at that point, the film merges him into these shots of revolutionary protests, both local and global, and that's how the film ends. So situated temporarily at a moment when the city was in a lockdown due to strikes of all kinds, what Sen does is merge Ranjit's anger into a larger landscape of political protests, as I said, which were both local and international, by students, workers, women, and so on. Never mind, Nidhi, it's okay. One way of reading the collocation of images, and please just imagine them, would be to see Ranjit's anger as almost a fusillade awakened by the experiences of the day that merged into revolutionary protests witnessed in the city and in other parts of the world during this time. Yet, there is nothing in either this scene or throughout the movie that actually suggests Ranjit's evolution as a revolutionary subject. His anger is not the climactic moment of a rising consciousness, but a bitter and immediate reaction to his frustrated self-interest. Everything that we have seen of Ranjit throughout the film suggests that his rage was not fueled by any extraordinary sense of purpose. True, he was victim to a larger systemic failure, a crumbling infrastructure, petty corruption, an inept and callous bureaucracy on the one hand, and his poorly paid job, penury, want on the other. But as that voice reminded him, he too was not above desiring a larger income that was supplemented by commissions and kickbacks. It is almost as if Sen was inviting us to think of what would happen if Ranjit was successful in the interview. Would he not be another addition to a smug middle class ensconced in their comfortable apartments? That he's not terribly reflective comes through in the scenes of his mother and sister catering to his everyday needs, like bringing him tea before he wakes up, or not having milk in their tea so that he can have some, or when he dreams aloud about a well-appointed apartment filled with new objects with his well-to-do girlfriend. Sen uses gender to invite critical reflection on the character of the angry young man. There is no indication throughout that this young man desired to change anything other than his own income. Hence his single-minded focus on a better job. At no point do we have any inkling of his political inclinations. He becomes a protester against the injustices of forces outside his control through the pressure of particular circumstances. While Sen portrays these circumstances sympathetically, is that enough evidence to constitute Ranjit as a revolutionary figure? If not, then what meaning do we attribute to Sen's decision to merge Ranjit's anger, the anger of an ordinary man impelled by his unique circumstances, with images of global revolutionary protests, what Sen described in an interview as a world-scale mobilization? Is it the case that all revolutionary anger arises out of self-interest, or is ideology blind to the needs of the everyman? What, if any, is the relationship between ordinariness and revolution? Some of these issues return again in Calcutta 71. Now, this film, contrary to the polarized opinions that followed its release, is expressive of the impossibility, Sen said, of his being partisan to any particular party or political line. It engaged the contemporary condition, again, in a historical vein. Like Interview, what we witness here in a much more elaborated form is an attempt to understand anger, the preeminent public emotion, irrespective of which side of the political spectrum one belonged to. Anger, Sen argued, was not the monopoly of only those who wished to shake up the status quo. Those who were invested in maintaining the established order of things experienced anger in equal measure. His portrayal of the so-called establishment is much more comprehensive in 71, and it encompasses the family, a dysfunctional civil society, and the state. And anger is a pervasive response of all those who feel helpless in the vice grip of each one of these institutions. So 71, as has been said over the course of the last 2 days, consists of 5 episodes. It begins and ends in 71, with 3 episodes in the middle, situated respectively in 33, 43, and 53. Each episode is linked to the next through a voiceover and intertitle, and that's the clip I really would have liked to have played for you, but I'm sorry that I can't, where you see him embodied here, but throughout the film, you actually don't get to see him. He appears only in the last scene. Throughout the film, you actually hear this plangent, disembodied voice saying, "My age is 20. During this time, I have been trudging for 1,000 years, making my way through poverty, blight, and death. I've been witnessing history for 1,000 years, a history of need, deprivation, and oppression." While the sojourner remains invisible until the very last sequences of the film, the revelation of his age, 20, establishes the importance of a young male functioning as a witness to a seemingly interminable historical condition that was at once ancient and modern. Unlike in Interview or Padatik, this young man has no known antecedents. Despite the fact that many reviews claimed, perhaps with some justification, that the man was a Maoist student activist, nothing in the film's diegesis actually states that fact. We know nothing about his family, his education, or his political affiliations. In tune with the rest of the trilogy, here too, you're taken through a montage of shots, stills, documentary, and found footage, and you realize that the city is the epicenter of action. It opens, as I said, with the courtroom scene, and common to all what it does through all the episodes is map the trajectory of anger through all the episodes. What was common to all the episodes is the condition of poverty that gave rise to the emotion of anger. What changes over the decades is its expression. Anger is the predominant emotion that is felt by, and I hope these are some. So it's the predominant emotion felt by the father of this impoverished family that's getting soaked in the rains and eventually seeks refuge at a neighbor's place. It's the predominant emotion animating Shobhana, played by Madhavi Mukherjee, who's a young, abandoned single mother who lives in a working men's mess in Kolkata with her brother, sister, and mother. And she and her sister have, in fact, we realize, taken to prostitution, but they have to keep it a secret in order to abide by certain values of bourgeois respectability. A different and more creative anger is at work in this fellow, Gourango, who heads a group of young boys who smuggle rice, recalling similar figures during the food riots that there were a lot of during the 1960s. Despite the episodic structure, the use of these three aforementioned episodes, which are based on three short stories, as we were told this morning, gave to the history of anger and poverty in Calcutta 71 a coherent, linear, and forward-marching narrative structure. The intertitle and voiceover by the young man, likewise, linked each decade to the previous one. It also helped viewers to not lose sight of Sen's argument about hunger and poverty being constant features of Indian life despite the country's transition from the colonial to the post-colonial state. Rage, blind and without a single target, seemed to be the only response available to people caught up in a blocked dialectic of poverty. This linear narrative of rage, however, goes asunder with the arrival of the episode that is set in 1971. Narrative certainty vanishes thereafter. Missing the narrative causality of the first three episodes, Sen's cinema becomes deliberately open-ended with the arrival into 1971. His goal, he argued, and this recalled something that Uday was talking about this morning, was to create the effect of political pamphleteering, he said. The chaotic nature of this episode seems to suggest that cinema's only task when faced with a crisis in political conviction was that of witnessing. The historicism that we saw at work for the previous decades loses certainty in 1971. As he put it, there was development from cold cynicism, ferment of rage within in 33, to anger and vengeance in 43, to rage itself turning into creative subversion in 53. With the arrival into 71, all that Sen can offer to do is to unveil, as it were, the faces of the merchants of oppression. But just as we see the faces of these multiple oppressors, politicians, socialites, police, political parties, the screen goes dark, thereby putting a brake on our impulse to hastily label any group or entity as the oppressor. Instead, what we get is this voice, and we finally see this man. So this brings us to the last film in the trilogy and the question of how best could anger be channeled into a politics capable of producing meaningful social change. And Padatik, which is the last film in the trilogy, gestures towards such an answer by clearing a space to undertake a sober reappraisal of anger and its aftermath. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you here have seen Padatik and will remember that Shumit's political life, as he says, has been a cycle of violence, arrest, escape, and more violence. So the question that he ponders throughout the film is whether or not there's a way out of that cycle. What were the responsibilities of the party leadership in organizing the band of foot soldiers like him who spend their time engaging in stray acts of terror and eluding the police? Introspection made him, as you saw, increasingly critical of the party leadership and the latter's sectional character. Now, the reception of the film actually was obsessively focused on the incongruity, or what most people saw as the incongruity of a young Naxal youth accepting the hospitality of somebody like Sheila Mitra. They also were extremely critical, they saw it as romantic and sentimental, the eventual union between the young angry Naxalite and his ex-nationalist father. But I want to spend the last few minutes that I have to focus on precisely these aspects which were actually dismissed by contemporary commentators to suggest that this is where these are three themes emerge from here, from our analysis of Padatik, which actually point us in a direction about the aftermath of anger. And very briefly, they are leftist politics as a broad coalition, intergenerational bonds, and creaturely comforts. And I won't get into the creaturely comforts simply because I don't have time. But think about his relationship, the union with the father and with Sheila Mitra. And remember the attitude survey and the way in which that attitude survey actually merges into Shumit concluding his letter, where he says that the lines in the letter are very significant. He says, if in our anger we commit acts, we make any errors, then history shall not forgive us. And just before that, in the attitude survey, we've actually heard comments about how the feminist movement has not quite addressed issues of sectionality, has not quite gotten to issues of privilege, and therefore has had certain pitfalls. Now, both reviewers at the time, as well as I think some of the comments we had at the end of the film that day, wondered about what the attitude survey was in fact doing in the film. I've wondered about it too, and I think that it actually plays a very central role in the articulation of what I'm calling anger and its aftermath, because Sen seems to be suggesting that both the women's movement and the leftist movement suffer from this business of trying to arrive at an answer of who is the friend, who is the enemy, who is the public that we are committed to if we so hastily label groups or classes that do not immediately share our ideological positions as the enemy. And when you think about it like that, you can see that there's almost a deliberate, maybe somewhat flat-footed way in which he brings together this Naxal with a character like Sheila Mitro. Because, and likewise, and I'm actually really jumping parts now, likewise with the father, if you've seen other parts of the trilogy, you'll see that this is an unusually sentimental ending for Sen. But I'd say that this intergenerational bonding, as well as this interclass bonding, is highly significant because by choosing to break these barriers of prejudices between a Maoist foot soldier and an upper class woman and this older man, Sen moves from Interview and Calcutta 71 and into Padatik, where anger becomes less about what historians of sentimentality and sentiments have called vehement passions. He emerges more as a man of sentiment, understood as distributed feeling. The dead, angry youth had only witnessed history's unfolding in Calcutta 71. As his successor, Shumit now wanted the history of the future to be molded not by revulsion producing anger, but by a sense of regard. He looks into the eyes and face of the other, Sheila or his father, in order to forge a politics through a relay of regard. The fate of women, as communicated by the attitude survey, had to be joined with the peasants, students, and other working people into a single coalition. Likewise, you'd have to form certain generational, or you'd have to form similar coalitions with previous generations. Otherwise, the marginalization of all hitherto disempowered social groups would continue as before. So let me conclude, and this is going to be a really hasty conclusion. But as Moinakda said, in 73, the year that Padatik releases, Satyajit Ray comes out with Oshoni Shanket, Distant Thunder. The reason I invoke it is because both directors, in a manner of speaking, responded to what Sen had called the quietism of Calcutta in 1943, 1943, where he said that there was stink, but not much anger, and he was talking about the famine. Now, for Rai, the conditions that produced the famine chronicled the end of his ideal of Shonar Bangla, Golden Bengal. For Sen, by contrast, and I'll finish in two minutes, the famine loomed as a much more global human condition whose past had merged into the present. This explains his repeated return to the idea of famine from Baishe Srabon, wedding day in 1960, to Akale Shandhane, In Search of the Famine in 1980, with these city films and his Telugu feature, Oka Uri Kotha, The Outsiders, 1977, in between. Seen thus, famine and poverty was not about the exploration of individual villainy. Its end, likewise, could not result from the heroic initiative of a single individual. Sen's quest, rather, was for the anger that he failed to see in Calcutta during 1943. And the trilogy was evidence that he found everyday life replete with it, and his attempt hereafter was to historicize it and understand it as a political emotion. In light of the above, it is not surprising that for Sen, the history of India over the long 20th century, and I quote him, is best told as a history of poverty. As he put it in an interview, the history of India is a continuous history, not of synthesis, but of poverty and exploitation. When asked to clarify whether he believed that the nature of exploitation remained unchanged over time, he noted that his focus was not exploitation, but poverty. How poverty debases human beings, disintegrates the whole pattern, the whole system. Poverty was the genesis to the anger that had not suddenly fallen out of anywhere. It had a beginning and an end, and he said he wanted to find this genesis and in that process redefine our history. And this was, in his own words, the extremely political task that he set out to execute in the trilogy. To define history in its right perspective meant the depiction of poverty as unrelenting and ruthless. Sen's Angry Young Man was the embodiment of a complex array of political sentiments that I've tried to outline. While this figure has had a rich and enduring life in popular Indian cinema, incarnated through Amitabh Bachchan, it had none of the irony that Sen packed into his portrayal of the angry young man. It was an ironical stance that ranged across his portrayal of this figure's immersion in revolutionary ideology to his obliviousness of skewed gender equations in family and society. In short, much of the political ambivalence that was constitutive of Sen's protagonists disappeared from this persona. So did the genealogy of his on-screen arrival, and that is the genealogy that I've tried to give you a little snapshot of in my presentation. Thank you.
Hello. I'm not returning to the once new Indian cinema with any kind of personal memory. I didn't watch cinema systematically till the 1990s. And I would also like to avoid revisiting this in the spirit of a Tomb Raider that Madhav's fleeting epigraph indicated. I have an interest in what gets consigned to the archive. I mean, not so much in the sense of what gets dumped there, but what chains of signification emerge in new ways when one revisits history through the archive. Now, what I'd like to do is present something about two films that I have watched in the recent past, two very different sorts of films, but in hindsight, it would not be incorrect to infer that far from pushing forward the declared agenda of radicalizing democracy, this was largely a phase characterized by a stalemate on some fronts and a rollback on others. Before taking stock of how the field of Malayalam cinema got reconstituted during this conjuncture, a cursory listing of some of the major landmarks involved in the transformations in Kerala during the 1970s, which are of relevance to my subsequent discussion on new Malayalam cinema, would be useful. For those of you who are familiar with it, just bear with me for a few minutes, because it may be useful for those who are coming newly to this history. In 1975, the Kerala Joint Family System Abolition Act was passed. It was implemented the next year in 1976, following almost a century of often acrimonious debate. And this legal abolition of the matrilineal Marumakatayam inheritance system, on which the best books are Arunima's own There Comes Papa for the phase until 1933 when the Marumakatayam system was abolished. And for the subsequent history, maybe Devika's work is also useful to look at what has happened subsequently. But it was in 75 that this act was again passed by the Kerala Legislative Assembly, setting off a new chain of consequences. And this was passed citing expedience and no other reason. It is expedient to abolish it. That's what the act said. Effected significant changes, not just in the economy of the state, but in many other domains, ranging from gender relations within the emergent nuclear families to the assumptions that animated the influential modes of Marxist modernization within the state. During the mid-70s, the Kerala Land Reforms Act was passed by the CPI-M-led coalition. It began to be implemented in bits and parts by the successor CPI-led coalition. This controversial legislation set off and had to contend with deep fissures and fractures within the polity. Parties such as the Muslim League and the Kerala Congress split. The Naya Service Society and the Sri Narayana Dharma Paripalana Yogam, SNDP, set up political wings to protect the interests of the other two powerful electoral factions in the state. The communist parties, which had already split during the mid-60s, causing deep dismay and confusion among the cadres, witnessed a further division between the trade unionist constituency led by the CITU and the technocratic developmental service sector mobilized around the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, with the discrepancy in the interest between these two factions becoming evident during the course of the Silent Valley movement, which peaked during the 1973 to 79 period. In 1975, again, the Kerala Scheduled Tribes Alienated Lands Act was passed, Although the revenue minister proclaimed that henceforth all alienated tribal lands would be viewed as stolen property that would be restored to tribals with effect from 26 January 1960, neither of the two main coalition fronts were able to or interested enough to implement it. Also in 1975, a group of social scientists working with K.N. Raj at the Center for Development Studies completed a highly influential UN-funded study titled Poverty, Unemployment and Development Policy, which was published in 1977, which argued that the state of Kerala was unique in having made considerable progress in areas like health, education and gender equality, despite its low per capita income and poor industrial growth, which soon led to well-known and controversial claims regarding the Kerala model of development. Something which Ashish referred to in the morning, the Gulf migration. B.A. Prakash writes, since the mid-70s, the factor which has had the greatest impact on regional economy, especially on labor market, consumption, savings, investment, etc., poverty, has been the Gulf migration and migrant remittances. This factor also closely intersected with the Malayalam film industry from the late 1970s, when, as noted by Uma Nair, the newly rich Gulf migrants were the most prominent of the new entrants into the film industry, both as producers and distributors, as well as in the form of a new lucrative international market for Malayalam films. Again, another point related to cinema, which Ashish referred to, the KSFDC, the Kerala State Film Development Corporation, was also started in 1975. And like in many other South Indian states, subsidies were made available for the production of cinema within the state. These moves were aimed at taking forward the perceived positive outcomes of the Indian government's support to foster a new cinema through institutions such as the Film Finance Corporation, FTII, National Film Archives, etc., and the new viewership for it created by the Autonomous Film Society movement. Together with the influx of new funding from the Gulf boom, these developments gave a huge boost to film production in the state of Kerala during this period. From an average of 27.2 films per year in the 1960s, production almost tripled to 81.8 films per year in the 1970s, and almost quadrupled to 113 films per year in the 1980s. Finally, 1975 was also a sort of annus mirabilis for the emergence of very significant young filmmakers who sought to introduce newer thematic and formal concerns into the field of Malayalam cinema. Perhaps never before or after has a single year witnessed the debut or rise to prominence of so many key directors, including the following. G. Aravindan's Uttarayanam, which was finished and shown in the festival circuits in 1974, was officially released on 11th April 1975, theatrical release. P.A. Bakar, Kabani Nadi Chubadnapol, was again made during 1975, though its theatrical release happened because of emergency restrictions, the delay in getting the censor certificate. It released in 76, but it was completed in 75. K.P. Kumaran's, whose Atithi has been referred to earlier, completed in 74, but again released in 75. I.V. Shashi, who is not a new wave filmmaker, but one of the most successful commercial filmmakers in India with close to 150 films. And indiancine.ma has about 60 of them, making him the single largest director in our archive at the moment. His first film, Ulsavam, came out in 1975. And the two filmmakers that I wish to talk about today, Bharatan, B.G. Bharatan, whose debut feature film Prayanam was released in 1975. This was also the debut of the screenwriter Padmarajan. And finally, K.G. George. His debut film Swapnam was completed in 1975 but released in 1976. As stated earlier, the sweeping changes within the polity and the field of cinema in Kerala during the mid-1970s resulted in rather mixed outcomes, caught as they were between the stated democratic demands and commitments on the one hand and the fracturing of any emerging consensus through hardening interest group politics within the realities of coalition governments on the other. It is also quite evident that in Kerala, the sort of public mobilizations and agitations that were rocking the urban streets and hinterlands of other states like Bengal, which Rochona has talked about, Gujarat, Maharashtra, during this period, had perhaps become a thing of the past. I am referring to the mass struggles led by the communist parties in the 50s and 60s in Kerala. We never had the movements on this scale. There was the Naxalite movement in Kerala, but nothing compared to what was going on in other parts of the country or what happened in the 50s and 60s in Kerala. That's my view. Given the despondency and confusion that ensued in the wake of the split within the Communist Party and its two factions vying for developmental progress primarily through unstable electoral coalitions, it might be said that the waves of revolution that Anand Patwardhan discerned in parts of North India prior to the national emergency of 1975 were perhaps not lapping the shores of Kerala with the same force. Indeed, in retrospect, the stalemated situation might perhaps more insightfully be viewed in terms of what several prominent political theorists and film scholars have analyzed within the Gramscian framework of a passive revolution of capital in post-colonial India. When the conditions do not exist for a successful war of maneuver through which there is a swift and momentous change and one ruling formation is decisively displaced and superseded by an opposing force, then there occurs a longer drawn-out war of position and a compromise is effected between powerful elite groups to defeat or to defer the challenge posed by the subaltern classes. In such a situation, Gramsci wrote that political progress occurs through the reaction of the dominant classes to the sporadic and incoherent rebelliousness of the popular masses, a reaction consisting of restorations that agree to some part of the popular demands and are therefore progressive restorations, or revolutions, restorations, or even passive revolutions. Based on this, it might be said that what such a restoration, primarily of ruling class interests, sets off, at most, are in fact waves of revulsion, in the two senses of the term. Politics acquires propensities based less on notions like the general interest and a united political will to effect decisive structural change, and more on mutual suspicions and animosities among various interest groups, resulting in effects of anxiety for the self placed against upper caste class interests within the narrative. But in the 1970s, the dreams and despairs of the individual, that too of the middle class caste young man, gradually came to the fore. In the rest of this paper, I shall examine two films from 1975 which were strikingly different from each other and yet had narratives built around similar concerns. The new Nair masculinity as it emerged from the ruins of the Marumakatayam system, marked by a deep anxiety or revulsion towards non-submissive Nair female subjectivity, reaching out for the autonomy and pleasures of urban modernity. Both films narrate stories of failed traditional marriages and the search for a happier romantic togetherness based on individual choice. Both films set up the problems faced by the central characters as historical rather than social, and frame their denouement in terms of individual self-discovery and assertion, rather than as part of collective social transformation. Indeed, although one film predominantly has a rural setting and the other is mostly set in towns and cities, both films are strikingly sparsely peopled. There are no subplots or choral interludes involving the community at large. These two films from 1975 are Bharatan's Prayanam, an austere yet evocative rural romance centered around a young Nambudiri woman and her extramarital relationship with a Nair man, and K.G. George's Swapnam, a modernist psychodrama centered around a young Nair man's mental breakdown following a doomed affair and a failed marriage. Marked by shades of David Lean's Ryan's Daughter, Bharatan's Prayanam was also viewed as thematically and stylistically related to the new wave films about rural suffering, desire and rebellion, the kind of films of B.V. Karant and Girish Karnad that Madhav had referred to earlier. Praised by critics and audiences alike at the time of its release, it is mainly remembered today for marking the filmic debut of two young men who would soon emerge as the leading exponents of the middle cinema during the 1980s, director Bharatan and scenarist Padmarajan. The title of the film has a range of connotations, including a voyage, an exploration, a struggle, progress, or even an attack or an assault on something. Prayanam was a low-budget yet deftly visualized film, with Bharatan and Balu Mahendra winning state awards for art direction and cinematography respectively. It tells the story of Savitri, a young rural Nambudiri woman from an impoverished family who gets married off by her father to an elderly temple priest, and her subsequent desire and adulterous relationship with Arvindan, a younger urbane Nair man who has returned to his ancestral home or Tarwad in the village, disenchanted by his painful experiences of rejection and failure in the world of urban modernity. In the beginning of the film, Savitri seems to accept the logic and helplessness behind her father's decision to give her in marriage to an older but learned and pious man who needs a replacement for his dead wife to take care of his household and his young son. I'll just show you some shots from the film because showing you clips will take time. So these images, I hope, will give you an impression of what this film is like. An adroitly filmed sequence in which the old pujari makes love to his young wife at home is followed by another in which he fantasizes making love to Savitri while performing rituals inside the temple, gazing intently at the idol of the goddess. A young man gets off the bus from the city, clutching books in his hand and a cigarette in his lips, drawing disconcerted stares from the villagers at his urban attire and habits, and he proceeds to a prominent tarwad in the village to live with his uncle at his family home. So here is Aravindan reaching the village and his home. There are images from his past in the form of photos on the wall, and he reaches out to the past. The uncle fails to recognize Aravindan at first, then welcomes him effusively to the Tarwad as his long-lost heir, saying that according to custom or according to the older laws, an uncle's property was meant for his sister's son. One evening, during a cultural event organized at their courtyard, Aravindan and Savitri notice each other and seem instantly attracted to each other. A short while later, Aravindan follows Savitri to a little shrine in the forest where she goes to pray with her stepson Apu. And while they are alone, Aravindan reaches out and caresses Savitri's face. She is shocked at first by his transgressive intimacy, but there is a change in her attitude towards him as she listens to his story of growing up as a lonely city boy and feeling neglected by his modern, hedonistic mother Ragini. His flashback shows her as a cheerfully boisterous woman who speaks Malayalam mixed with English, is fashionably dressed in sleeveless blouses and goggles, plays card games with male friends at night, while her elderly male domestic servant puts young Aravindan to bed. Some of you might remember Loyola College from Agraharathil Kadide. The cinematographer is the same. Some of the locations are repeated. And we finally see her leaving Aravindan at a missionary boarding school, telling him to study well and become a great man. So this is what is wrong with her. Okay. At a later point in the film, we also hear Aravindan's young father sorrowfully within the family for Ragini, that is Aravindan's mother, to be permitted to get a college education, and how getting educated had changed her into a selfish, independent woman pursuing her freedom and fun in the city. Aravindan also tells Savitri about a further trauma in his youth when an American woman with whom he had fallen in love suddenly dumped him and went off with another man. Okay. Aravindan and Savitri begin a passionate affair which goes on until it is discovered one evening by her husband, who promptly takes her back to her father and leaves her there, irked not just by her infidelity but also by her not apologizing for her lapse. Okay, this is the discovery and then the aftermath. Ammani Amma, a friendly neighbor who used to look after the Pujari's son, her husband's son Apu, and his home before his marriage to Savitri, urges the Pujari to forgive his errant wife and get her back home. The Pujari and Savitri's father both insist that for the sake of their self-respect, they say we are economically very poor, we have nothing but we have our self-respect. For the sake of their self-respect, the other must take the initiative to accompany Savitri back to her marital home. Finally, Savitri returns home by herself, alone, nobody accompanies her, and she returns essentially as Apu's mother because her husband refuses any further interaction with her. Although Aravindan makes several attempts to contact Savitri again, she avoids meeting him, determined not to repeat the earlier mistake which had almost unhinged her life. But one evening, as she stays back home while the whole village is attending a temple festival, Aravindan approaches her house and seemingly on impulse, she rushes out into his arms. As they hug, the fireworks from the temple festival light up the night sky. The film ends with a shot of the morning after, with Savitri's disembodied voice telling her stepson Apu that just as each river had to make a natural journey from the mountains to the sea, every person had to set out on a journey that would take her to the destined end, indicating perhaps that she has left the village with her lover Aravindan. Let us now consider the second film, KG George's Swapnam. George was trained at the FTII and had worked under Ramu Karyat alongside John Abraham in the early 1970s before making Swapnam in 1975. This film was as well received by critics and audiences alike as Prayanam had been, but it was strikingly different in terms of its largely urban settings as well as its narrative organization, marked by jagged flashbacks, hallucinatory sequences, and an adrift sense of ending. Swapnam was made explicitly under the sign of New Cinema. In a tribute to KG George published in September 2013, his FTII batchmate and Swapnam cinematographer Ramachandra Babu wrote a poem which included the following lines. My friend led the way in the darkness. His pole star was called Fellini. At last the long night seemed to end. The new cinema hangs frozen on the horizon like a Truffaut ending. The weary world watches hopefully for the slightest upward movement to pronounce a new dawn. George had also got his teacher from the music department of FTII, Bhaskar Chandravakar, to compose a few songs for the films, but decided to leave them out in deference to the new cinema convention. Although Chandravakar's soundtrack for the film did win him the State Award for Best Background Score. Like in Prayanam, George's film too was plotted around a failed traditional marriage, but at the center was a young Nair man named Gopi who found it difficult to fit into the demands of urban modernity. Swapnam was based on a short story written by a clinical psychologist named Psycho Muhammad and carefully reworked by the well-known Malayalam novelist Pamman and by KG George himself. The film opens with a sequence in Madras where Parameshwaran, a man who has lost his memory, wanders desultorily around until he ends up at a psychiatric institution. Maybe some scenes, this is him waking up in a beach in Madras, gets up, walks around the city in a daze, it's called the fugue state in the film, and then he ends up with some psychiatrist in a hospital. A team of Malayali doctors soon subject him to narco-analysis in order to extract information from the depths of his mind about his identity and his past. This enforced testimony, there you see him being injected with drugs to make him speak the truth. This enforced testimony reveals that the man's real name is Gopi and that he is in fact a doctor from Trivandrum. Dr. Gopi proves to be a very cooperative patient and declares that he wishes to reveal everything about his miserable life frankly and without any shame. The jigsaw puzzle of his life is reassembled through a set of intermittent drug-induced flashbacks. Gopi, a bright young man from a poor family, had his medical education funded by a rich uncle in the expectation that Gopi would become his son-in-law by marrying his daughter, it is Gopi's cousin and Morappana, Sumitra, as per custom. Although Gopi had fallen in love at medical college with a classmate named Kamalam, he is forced to split with her and fulfill his obligation of marrying his cousin, not merely on account of his financial indebtedness to his uncle, but because, as Gopi's mother reminds him, he and Sumitra have been betrothed since birth. They soon start their married life in a town where Gopi is appointed as a doctor, settling into a comfortable house that belongs to the family of Sumitra's college friend Rosi and is paid for by Sumitra's father. Gopi remains despondent with the marriage he has been forced into, and especially with what he perceives as Sumitra's inability or unwillingness to integrate into his own poorer family, and with her constant complaints that she feels bored as a housewife when he is out at work, and with her desire for frequent outings and for shopping. A major source of tension, this is the house into which they move. These are conversations. After their married life, they talk to each other. We see them talking to each other on the phone very frequently because they don't spend time together. A major source of tension early in their marriage is her keenness and his reluctance to go on a honeymoon trip. As she says, many of her friends have done. When he finally relents, their trip to nearby Kovalam turns out to be a major disappointment for Sumitra, as Gopi had not made an advance booking for a room at a good resort, and they are forced to stay in a hotel she does not like. While he pours himself a drink and says that they ought to think of starting a family soon, she angrily dismisses the suggestion and goes off to sleep in a huff. What is also interesting is that if you remember some of the scenes, like this one, this is a standard trope in Indian films of a romantic couple walking one behind the other, but it's usually a man in front and a woman at the back. And here you have a situation reversed where she is going off, they're silent, they're not talking to each other. There are also shots of, where people place their feet on the other person's footsteps. So you have these played off, but not in a funny romantic way, but it's opposite. Upon their return, Gopi begins to spend more time at his workplace, and since household chores are mostly done by a resident domestic help, Sumitra begins to get desperately lonely and restless with her existence. She goes occasionally out for shopping with Rosie and playing cards with Rosie and her brother Mohan, a hedonist who has been sent home to Kerala in disgrace from Singapore and is currently a businessman securing contracts by bribing bureaucrats. As tensions and conflicts mount at home, Gopi starts drinking excessively, the marriage collapses, and so does his mind. So here is he beginning to have what initially looks like a friendship with the domestic servant, and then increasingly the suggestion is it may be a different affair with a servant, and then finally forcing her to drink, because he is an alcoholic by the end of the film. One day he suddenly leaves home in an amnesiac delirium and ends up in Madras. The twist in the tale comes when Dr. Isaac and Dr. Venu, the psychiatrists, so here are sequences where he imagines that he has killed his wife and is burying her in a beach. Then he goes off in a scooter, he falls off, and again passes into a delirium. And that's where then he finally ends up. He has hallucinations of various people from his life haunting him like apparitions. The twist in the tale comes when Dr. Isaac and Dr. Venu, the two psychiatrists treating him, have a hunch that Gopi's unconscious had led him to Madras because his old lover Kamalam was now settled in the city. In an attempt to shock Gopi back into reality, Dr. Venu brings him face to face with Kamalam, who now in fact happens to be Dr. Venu's own wife. Discovering this has a further effect of shattering Gopi, and he rushes off, pursued by a flock of hallucinatory demons consisting of his family, friends, and colleagues to whom he cannot relate any longer. The film ends abruptly with Gopi speeding away on a scooter on a desperate ride seemingly to nowhere. So this is the moment where he recognizes her and she runs off. He goes to her house and discovers that she is now married to his doctor, and off he goes. This is the final sequence of the film where he is going off. I'll wind up now. As already stated, Prayanam and Swapnam are visually and thematically quite different films, as you might have guessed. Yet, some of the parallels between them seem significant. In both films, a young Nair woman's interest in and confident fitting into urban modernity is presented as threatening to the emergent Nair male desire for a proper family with a mother-wife who is restrained and submissive, not driven by a self-assured autonomy, perhaps symbolically reminiscent of a now superseded and excessive matrilineal setup. Both Ragini in Prayanam and Sumitra in Swapnam are projected as disruptive embodiments of Nair women's adoption of urban modernity, and such projection serves to accentuate the misery they cause in the Nair men who aspire to be their moral custodians and whose newfangled expectations they reject. Their villainous trait appears to consist in the fact that neither woman is shown as repenting for the misery that her desire for happiness causes in the men in their lives. In Prayanam, the prior rejection and exorcism of such unruly modernity through Arvindan's and his uncle's accounts about Ragini does not appear to morally conflict with Arvindan's own transgressive affair with Savitri, a submissive village woman caught in an unfair marriage. And although the film does not quite emphasize this, Savitri's own irresponsible bid for freedom and happiness at the end of the film might be seen as paralleling an aspect that was earlier demonized in Ragini. If Ragini had rejected the maternal ideal by refusing to reduce her life to an exclusive role as nurturer, so does Savitri in her disembodied farewell address to her stepson Apu. However, within the narrative logic of the film, Savitri's choice is not framed as disruptive, since it is made explicitly in submission to the desire of the young Nair man. Sumitra too in Swapnam is dismissive of the maternal ideal expected of her. She impetuously tosses aside suggestions that she read up books on childbirth and baby care, and when Gopi informs his mother that Sumitra had decided not to have a baby for the time being, and his mother responds that only God and not human agents could decide about the birth of children, Gopi reports that Sumitra regularly consumed God in the form of pills in order not to get pregnant. An initial comparison, this is the closing, an initial comparison of these two films might suggest that what Prayanam relays is a revulsion towards a dead Brahminical tradition, whereas in Swapnam, the primary effect conveyed is revulsion towards a stillborn modernity. That the former sets itself against the patriarchal superciliousness and hypocrisy of the dysfunctional Nambudri life world, while the latter targets the corrosive egotism that marks the reformed Nair community's foray into urban modernity. And finally, that Prayanam works with a lyric realism to valorize and scientific modernity represented through the medical or psychiatric expertise. Since we are short of time, I'll skip a little bit and let me just conclude. Okay, I have a quotation from Ratish which I will read. I'll take it that you are familiar with what Ratish has said about Nair masculinity, his arguments about that. And I'll conclude by saying that refracting this change within the remaking of masculinity within the Nair community during the period 1940 to 1970, refracting this change within the field of Malayalam cinema, there was a pulling away from the dominant trend of socialist agitprop realism of the 1950s and 60s while retaining its caste and gender biases more or less intact. There was also a drawing back from the task of imagining a radical cinematic modernism while responding to the critical and aspirational energies of newly mobilized and assertive groups. Instead, one might say that there was a two steps backward march towards a domesticated individualism in most of the middle cinemas in Malayalam during the 1980s and 1990s, of which Bharathan, Padmarajan and K.G. George emerged as the leading lights, and continuing into the new generation cinema of the 2010s, in which their work is often referenced as a lost ideal. So, to wit, a modernizing retreat from modernity, a politics of revulsion, not revolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these two rich and very suggestive papers. What I'm going to do actually is to just raise a few remarks which might help us to think about the larger concerns of both the papers and the session generally. So I will not speak specifically to each paper, let's say chronologically, but go back and forth. When I was listening to both the presentations and particularly to Satish's, I did think that at the end that I should respond to the specificities of your reading of the films, which I wasn't planning to do earlier, but I must say, even though it wasn't on Indian cinema, I did find them on YouTube. So I hadn't ever seen Prayanam. I'm really happy I did see it. And Swapnam, I have autobiographical stories about this, which I shall reserve for later. So the question that Rochona starts with is something that I think interests me enormously, which is how does one actually, she doesn't phrase it in quite the same way, but how does one actually use or engage cinema to think about history, which is not to treat history as something outside, as framing cinema, but how does one actually engage with the cinematic context, the specific cinematic context that you're actually thinking about? How does one name or mark history? Is it going to be as in the kind of traditional history writing where you have date or place or big movements, which is within an older mode of historiography? Or how does one engage small lives and little people? So the question really is, are other modes of historic narration possible, which is really what interview is about, in some senses, it seems to me. Now, when I was reading your paper, Rochona, and also listening to your presentation, and I watched 1.5 of the films that you were speaking about, I must confess I didn't have enough time to see them all, it did strike me about why is it that the decennial imagination after 1947 becomes the mode in which we think about period, which is to say we speak about the 60s or 40s or 50s and so on and so forth, and how far is this tenable? So the question for me then is, how does one think about the decennial imagination in some senses? I'm not saying let's dispense with that, but how does one read that alongside with the quotidian, the everyday, which is of concern to you? So to use a very productive idea, which Geeta Kapoor developed in a very different context, the representational dilemma of filmmakers. How does one actually engage that in the context of new cinema? And that seemed to me to be the primary concern in much of the films of this period. I mean, there are, whether you call it amateur or whether one thinks about the kinds of, the production of the New Critic, as were then flagged in the morning in response to Moinak and Ashish's paper. There are interesting kinds of, shall we say, juxtapositions, cinematic juxtapositions within the films of that period, none of which need produce a coherent narrative, but there are interesting kinds of questions. So I thought that the idea of a representational dilemma might actually be quite productive in this sense, in thinking about what the filmmakers are doing. And in that, I just want to actually use one kind of example to think about. The texts themselves are very rich, and they have talked us through a variety of different kinds of sites and positions. But the one that seemed to me to be recurrent in all the films that have been discussed here is that of the familial. The kind of resilience, shall we say, of the familial, and how that becomes a site for producing affect. Now, what I thought was kind of interesting is the manner in which, on the one hand, there's the production of the individual via struggle. Therefore, what is interesting is that unlike classic Marxism, or even the more recent sort of autonomous imaginations of revolutionary subjectivity, what we are looking at really are a sort of very fractured sense of selfhood that's actually produced through constant engagement with the familial and not with class struggle. And that, it seemed to me, would be an interesting kind of way to think about what is actually happening in the context of not just these films, but let us say other cultural texts which actually engage with the question of the revolutionary subject. And I'm thinking here in one instance of autobiography. So, for instance, Rigoberta Menchu's classic, the Guatemalan revolutionaries' classic text, I, Rigoberta Menchu, which many of us here must have read, where you actually go through quotidian acts and experiences into a thinking about the making of a revolutionary. So what is interesting with, let us say, engaging that, or let us say more recent kinds of ethnographies of Maoist movements and so on, where people have been studying gendered natures of revolution or subjectivity, I think what that pushes us to do is, how can one use, let us say, these kinds of cultural texts or political texts? How can one use that to reread or even critique, shall we say, programmatic readings of revolution and subjectivity? So, which is to say, what is the individual subject to? Right? And not merely the relationship between party and family. And, I think that might actually be a far more productive way of opening up some of the kinds of questions that seem to be coming up in both the contexts that you are discussing. The fifth kind of a concern that I had while reading the text was the question of anger that Rochona fronts in her paper. That is the kind of site for her reflection, for rethinking not just Mrinal's sin, but the period, and to see whether anger can be an entry point into sort of rethinking the landscape of the new cinematic moment in that period and the new political. So in that sense, we are invited to think about the affective properties and the propensities and also the representation of anger within these films that you have discussed. And of course, Interview, which I saw fully, and Padatik, which I saw half of. I mean, what I was of course struck by, and you make those remarks certainly in relation to Padatik, but I thought that what was interesting to me, of course, in relation to Interview was that it is that final act. And then, of course, Mrinal Sen speaks about that in the interview that actually you cite them. Now, when I was reading the text and listening to you present, I was thinking about another context of anger, and which is the same period, and more recently, feminist scholars have been thinking and writing about this. I'm thinking about Barbara Tomlinson's recent work on feminist anger. And I was thinking that the 70s is a period of, and you refer to that in your paper as well in a different sense, of early women's movements, early modes of thinking feminism, and so on and so forth. But what is actually striking is the manner in which anger is actually refused to the feminist subject in some senses. So it is an interesting question about feminist anger versus the male revolutionary anger. How does one engage anger? How does one actually begin to think about anger's productive possibility within a progressive ideology's imagination? And of course, there are questions about masculinity. But I think what it also leads us to think about is the dilemma about violence. And the manner in which, as we know in the context of, certainly the 80s and 90s, and subsequently we have had thematizations of good violence versus bad violence, the manner in which anger leads to violence. And of course here, Benjamin's critique of violence then doesn't allow us to enter that kind of terrain of good versus bad violence. And therefore, is there a manner in which one can read back into good anger versus bad anger? What is it that is actually being, suggested in the context of anger here, in the context of the making of a revolutionary subject? And I thought that might be in the refusal of certain subjects, possessing anger, being angry, and so on and so forth. What can we actually do with the non-ability to be angry? So the counterfactual there might be actually interesting. Now moving to the 1970s, and in a very different sense, of course, Udayan's remarks in the morning also address this, but differently. I frame a variety of things that we want to actually think about. So how do we actually think about these longer histories and different kinds of futures? How do we think of a different kind of thematization? So if we are to think about the larger world of poetry, literature, criticism, and so on and so forth, any number of names were coming to my mind when I was reading your paper. Kadamanetta, K.G. Shangarapilla, M. Govindan, Vinay Chandran, Ayyappa Panikar, Sachidanandan, P.K. Balakrishnan, Kamala Das, any number of people like that. And I thought that it might actually be interesting if one is to situate what you are thinking about within a longer, since you are interested in a certain kind of Marxist reading of these films, of course you may want to disrupt that as well. But if you were, then would it be productive to actually think about the Marxist criticality of the 40s? So the triumvirate of Mondasheri, MP Paul, C.J. Joseph, and so on and so forth, via a kind of history of cultural production of the 50s and 60s, which is Bhasi and so on, and the manner in which there is an encounter or engagement, and the way in which the and then, of course, by the 70s, right? And so what it seemed to me to be happening by the 70s is that there are different kinds of strains. The temporalities do not match. The decennial doesn't actually, wrap it up in such a neat way. There are different dimensions, and it's not possibility to homogenize that. And I think that impossibility is something we want to keep alive there, because I think that would open up really interesting kinds of questions for us. Revulsion versus revolution. How does one actually think about that? In both these texts, these are issues that have actually come up. Again, it seems to me that, if we were to engage the quotidian, which is of interest very head-on in Rochona's paper, but also, I think, in your reading of the films, I think there are far greater overlaps between revulsion and revolution. So I don't think that, so my question would be that without necessarily adopting the position of theorists like Gramsci or Marx, is there a way in which one can think about the problem of selfhood or autonomy within Marxist theorizations of subjectivity? So, which is to say that, through the political conundrum from the 50s and 60s of Marxism, via feminisms and Dalit politics, or let's say race politics from 70s through to the 2000s, what we are looking at is a very difficult triangulation of collectivity, community, and individual. And this triangulation doesn't doesn't give you three corners of a triangle. It's actually a very difficult kind of set of relationships, which is the site of struggle, as it was. And I think it actually raises a far more serious question about the subject of politics. And this is, of course, something that feminists have been addressing continuously from the 80s onwards, who is the subject of feminism, which it seemed to me is not a dilemma within, let us say, Marxist revolutionary writing and representations, because it's always assumed that you know who the revolutionary subject is, and I'm not so sure that is actually so easily possible. One last main point and two side things, and I think I'll leave the side comments from the discussion, and maybe we can chat about that later, which is the question, and I think it came up in the morning in a different context, which is how does one actually think about Marxism in the post-colony? And there I was actually struck by the resilience of questions of the familial, but also about questions of selfhood and subjectivity, which is, can we actually think, or should we treat the films of the 1970s as an invitation to rethink the travel of Marxism and its post-colonial encounter and the many meanings that one can actually see within the post-colonial context, and the cinematic is such an interesting sort of way of entering that. Finally, a couple of things. One, what does one do with the tribal or working class body? How does that actually circulate within the representational imaginary of this new cinematic moment? I thought that, I was continuously seeing that the universal protester in Interview, for example, or Uma in John Abraham's, Agraha Tilagarde, or in The Domestic Idyll, when, Aravindan dreams of their marital life, they immediately become sort of tribalized in a sense. That's the manner in which it moves. So I thought that actually needs far more unpacking. And I must say that, unlike your reading of Prayanam, I was actually struck by the radicalism of a married Nambudiri woman having an extramarital affair, a hypogamous affair with an Nair man. So there may be a completely reversed way of reading that. And finally, the question of the soundtrack and humor. So I was actually thinking that, yesterday when I was watching, John Abraham, I was thinking that it's really funny how he uses the morsing to do the soundtrack for the Brahman Walk, or the clacking of the scissors in the Interview, in the sort of the scene in the haircutting saloon. So there's something really interesting about the minimalist manner in which orality is actually used to produce certain kinds of affective moments. Thank you so much.